It's a testament to the drawing power of this evening's guest that we have a packed house, and it's well deserved. And because it's clear that Sendhil is a well-regarded and well-known commodity, I'm not going to take any time to introduce him, since I think it seems he needs no introduction. I'll instead spend just a couple of minutes telling you about the speaker series that Sendhil is coming in as a part of, and use that as a segue into just a few words on Sendhil and the presentation he'll give this evening. This is part of our Research Meets Practice speakers series at the Social Enterprise program. Social enterprise covers many academic disciplines. So we often find ourselves in a position of wanting to co-sponsor events with other groups within the business school. So this is co-sponsored this evening with the Center for Decision Sciences, so we're grateful for their help in running tonight's event. This event is also in the spirit of one of the overarching missions of the business school, which is to look for those important points of intersection between the research that takes place at a business school and the practical applications out in the so-called real world. Sendhil is the latest Research Meets practitioner to join us. He follows in the footsteps of some very eminent prior speakers. Just within the discipline of economics, we've had a couple of Nobel Prize winners, including most recently Mike Spence, who came to speak with us last year. We had a very lively discussion with a historian of Ayn Rand and her lasting influence on political discourse in this country. It definitely packed the house and, let's say, brought some alternative viewpoints out of the woodwork, so to speak. And we're very happy to have Sendhil here this evening. I can say that I've known Sendhil for half of my life, and it is very humbling to be in the presence of such an individual who's accomplished so much at what I can no longer say is a tender young age. So he is a certified genius, according to the MacArthur Foundation, and has done really path-breaking work at the intersection of psychology and economics, and in the spirit of this evening's event, has often applied these ideas to important social questions. So I'll turn things over at this point to Sendhil. He has about 45 minutes to give a presentation and then take questions from the audience.
All right. All right. Thanks, Ray. If you said anything embarrassing, I'd already had stuff prepared that was embarrassing about you. So, but you know what? Since I'm going second, maybe I can release them now. All right, I won't do it. There's a seat right up here if someone is standing, and then these two people feel like no one likes them. So, but I guess no one does. All right. So I'm going to talk about primarily this book that I wrote with Eldar Shafir. One of my friends, John, is always asking, can I just buy the little book in there? Because that feels like that's got all the important information. But no, you can't just buy the little book. So let me start with a story. This is a story from 4 or 5 years ago. I was entirely too busy, and I felt like overwhelmed. I was not answering my emails. I was running late to meetings. I was double booking things. I was not getting things done. I wasn't even calling my mother at the frequency that I should. And I remember I called up Eldar and I said, I've got, this is just not a tenable way to live. I've got a solution to this problem. And the solution to this problem was quite simple. The solution was I was going to start by saying no to everything new. Because, I had a bunch of stuff I need to get done. So nothing new. Then that would lead to a period where my workload would come down and down and down. And then once that was manageable, I would then switch to saying yes, but in a much more judicious way than I've done so far. It was like a great plan, a very good plan. And Eldar mentions that, I think about a week after I told him this, I called him up and said, there's this really, a friend of ours is putting together this book and they want us to write a chapter. We really should do that. Apparently with no irony in my voice. And I don't know how to have irony in my voice, so maybe that was the problem. But no, I think I really didn't understand the inconsistency. And so, why am I telling you this story? Well, obviously this has something to do with my horrible time management, but there's something else that went on in this, which is the chapter we wrote for that book was actually about the lives of low-income individuals. And there's something interesting in the lives of low-income individuals. It's about the debt that they have. So I don't know if many of you know payday loans. Payday loans are an interesting thing. They're basically a loan that you can take out for less than 2 weeks, because your payday is coming up, 10 days from now, 5 days from now. So you take this loan, and for like a couple of $100, and then you'll repay it in 5, 7, 8 days when your payday arrives. And you'll repay this $200 loan, you may pay like $40. So that's a pretty high interest rate for a 5-day loan. But this is a very common phenomenon. It's so common that there are more payday lenders, more payday storefronts in the United States, almost, than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. It's shockingly common. So the interesting thing about people in payday loans, and it's true of the poor in general, is that these guys are stuck in this debt cycle. They're basically just like, borrow this payday loan. Then when it comes time to repay, guess what they do? They take another payday loan. And they get stuck and stuck. And when you read the lives of these people, or when you do interviews, you see that they're stuck in this sort of debt trap. A debt trap which in many ways is of their own making. Of course, in some ways it's not, because this is a pretty expensive product. But they sort of took the first loan. And even when they're in these loan cycles, they'll do things like buy a DVD player. Why buy a DVD player? So I hope you see there's an analogy here between these two situations. You could argue that I, too, was in a debt trap. I was in a time debt trap. I'd over-borrowed with my Time credit card, and I'm spending most of my time repaying past commitments that I've made. And you could also see that I'm a pretty shitty manager of time. I'm a pretty shitty manager of time in the same way that someone might look at a low-income individual and say, what a shitty manager of money in this narrow sense. And this is what led us to wonder, is there some analogy here? And one obvious case is that both of us have too little of something. I had too little time. The poor have too little money. And there's a little bit of way you can even connect this. Like, think of the money poor and the time poor. The money poor will say things like, oh, I could pay this bill later. The time poor will say things like, oh, I could do this. This can wait. The money poor, well, an interesting thing happens when you're money poor. Basic goods, your kid is just, turning 8 and you want to buy them a birthday gift. Can you buy them a good birthday gift? That's sort of like a very basic thing to do. But when you're poor, that basic thing becomes a luxury. Similarly, when you're time busy, time poor, spending time with your kids on a Tuesday evening might become a luxury. So basic goods become luxuries. But also some behaviors. For example, you might see a poor person and say, like I said earlier, my God, you're so poor. Why on earth did you buy that DVD player? But someone could look at you and say, you're so busy. Why are you wasting time playing Angry Birds? So there's some analogies here with this sort of, it's a little superficial. But the question I wanted to ask, and that we started with, was, is there some deeper science of scarcity? Is there something about scarcity that we can sort of understand as a science? And as I was working on this, there was I was telling a colleague of mine about this, and he was like, oh, that's really interesting. It's funny because you should say that, because there is a science of scarcity. You might have heard of it. It's called economics. And in fact, I had heard of it. It's an interesting field. And so really what I want to tell you today is that there is a big difference between what I'm going to tell you about the science of scarcity and what economics says about scarcity. So to understand that, I'm going to tell you a little story. This is a picture of the kind of drinks Ray drinks. I don't know if you still like the cherry Ray, but this is 3-4 years ago. So imagine you go to dinner and the waiter or waitress comes and says, oh, we've got a special cocktail. They describe it to you. Sounds interesting. And you're thinking, oh, should I buy this cocktail? Should I have this cocktail? What are all the things that come to mind when you're thinking about this? Any ideas? You can just shout right out. How much is it? How much is it? What does it cost? This is New York, so let's say it costs $15 because it's on sale. What else comes to mind? How will it taste? Yeah. Am I going to be driving tonight? I guess it's New York, so you're probably not asking yourself that question. Can I stumble my way home? Is my friend drinking? Because it's been a while since you've drunk alone, so, probably a good idea to stop that. So there are a lot of things that come to mind. Ironically, with a crowd like this, there is something that does not come to mind. Something that would come to mind if you were poor, but actually almost nobody in this audience actually thinks about this thing. It's kind of funny. So to get you to think about this thing, I want you to rethink this story. Just do it again. Except now I want you to imagine you're on a diet. Okay? You've decided in order to get fit, you need to have whatever, 2,000 calories a day or whatever, something, whatever number sounds reasonable. So now does something come to mind?
If I drink this now, what do I have to give up?
Exactly. Everyone on a diet knows this. I can have this cookie, but if I have this cookie, I can't have that cookie. Now think about that. As a diet, when you're facing sort of calorie scarcity, you immediately understand that there's a trade-off. But of course, there's a trade-off with money too. If you buy this $15 cocktail, there is something you're not going to buy. In fact, that's the point of economics. The point of economics is that all things are scarce and all things induce trade-offs. But this little story tells you something profound. All things may be scarce, but they don't actually feel that way. What would it even mean for you to sit there and say, okay, what will I not buy if I buy this cocktail? I have a lot of money in the bank. I could buy this cocktail and everything else I want too. I don't even know what you're asking me. It's a stupid question. Of course, it's a stupid question in a psychological sense, but it's actually a very true question. If we just did the accounting of it, I hate to break it to you, you may have a lot of money in the bank, but you don't have an infinite amount of money in the bank. If you buy a $15 cocktail, we do the accounting, there is $15 less you will buy over your lifetime. Just must be. Economists are right, as much as it's sad to admit that fact. But this distinction between the psychology of scarcity, the experience of scarcity, where when you're money rich, trade-offs aren't there. Think about it. Isn't it amazing that if you went for a jog and you lost $20, you may be annoyed at yourself, but you don't actually feel any poorer. It's as if your life is an infinite supply of $20 bills. That's the psychology of abundance, the feeling that there really aren't trade-offs. Whereas the psychology of scarcity, which you've experienced when you've had a diet, is the feeling that when you do something, something else is being given up. Here's some data where you simply just can even ask people. Ask low-income, and we've done this in India, we've done this in the US. Ask low-income individuals, high-income individuals. Just think about buying a television. What all comes to mind? Of course, they say the usual things. Is it high def? Is it, I don't know, there's even some new format now. What is it, 4T or something? 4X? No one knows? 4K. See, somebody does know. Well, okay, good for them. Bad for me. And you just write down what their responses are, and you code up the responses in which people say, yeah, when I think about buying this TV, I think about what I won't buy instead. And you find, and everything I'm going to show you, high income, low income, is kind of very crudely measured. I'm just going to cut by median, so some of the high income people are actually low income, but it'll just give you a sense. Here's a percentage of people who, on their own, report that they'll spontaneously think of trade-offs for a TV. You can see that the low income are twice as likely to say, oh yeah, what will I give up? Now, all this is just to get you into the mood, so to speak. This is foreplay. I want to give you a sense there is a big difference between the psychology of scarcity and the economics of scarcity. But I haven't really told you what is the psychology of scarcity. I think we'd be wrong to say the psychology of scarcity is just thinking about trade-offs. I think it's much more fundamental. And to understand what that is, I want to go back to 1943. So this is 1943. There's a war. I don't know if you guys have heard. It's World War II. I don't know if any of you have heard this. I have to say this now because when I, in class, mentioned the Cold War or the Berlin Wall, most of my students have no idea what that is. I guess their history classes don't get that far. So World War II, the Allies are now taking Europe, and as they're retaking Europe, they're finding all these people who are starving. And so they're curious. Well, not just curious, they have to know, what do we do with these starving people? So the Allies are in a great position. They've got lots of food. But their question is more biological. How do we refeed these starving people? For example, do we just give them all the food they want? Or is that going to send their body into shock? Maybe that's bad for them. Maybe we should give them a little bit more than they eat right now, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, sort of ratchet it up. What should we do? Kind of an interesting question, without an obvious answer. So they went to the scientists at their time, and the scientists said, yeah, very good question. We don't know. Let us run a study. As you can see, some things don't change. And they ran a study. It was called the Minnesota Refeeding Study. But of course, as you probably can gather, they got a bunch of volunteers. They put them into a big dorm in Minnesota. And the first step of a refeeding study is, you can imagine, starve them. So for 6 months, they starved these men. And actually, while we learned something about refeeding, we learned much more about hunger and what hunger does to the human body in this study. So this is actually a man from this study, and this is him at the beginning. This is not him at the bottom. It was actually him, actually somewhat early on. And you can actually see that it's only early on if you've studied. Can anyone see why it's only early on? Yes, okay. So one of the things we learned in this study was, for example, not relevant for what I'm going to tell you, but it's an interesting fact. When you start starving somebody, weight goes down, down, down. Big surprise. But then guess what happens? Weight starts going up. That hasn't happened to this man yet. Weight starts going up because edema kicks in. And edema is the retention of water, and that's why you see all these bloated stomachs. His stomach's not bloating yet. But we learned other amazing things. I just have to tell you, this stuff is crazy. For example, we knew that muscle degradation would happen, but we never understood how big muscle degradation would be. So here's an example. The men could not shower and shampoo their hair because they couldn't lift their hands up to their heads. Their traps and their triceps lost so much muscle mass. It was painful for them to get their hands up that high. So that's the physical, and there are a lot of physical things we learned. And this study was not really about that, but because these were good researchers, they documented everything. You have these men in these dorms for 24/7. They just wrote everything down. So we even learned things that they weren't intending to learn, like what it did to the psychology of these men. And so some of the psychological findings were somewhat obvious. For example, it turns out, and you may want to write this down, if you're hungry, you get angry, annoyed, and upset. People don't like being hungry. That's not a newsflash. But you know what is a newsflash? What these men did with their free time. So they had no constraint on their free time. They could do whatever they want. Guess what the modal pastime was? Reading cookbooks. Another pastime, they would open up the newspaper. Back then, newspapers would have food from the local supermarkets with the prices on there. That's what they would do. They would just survey the prices of the food items. At some point, the researchers asked them, hey, out of curiosity, hey, when you leave this study, what are you going to do? Afterwards. Over half of them said, I'm going to start a restaurant. Now, I don't want to ruin this 2-volume novel for you, but none of them started a restaurant. What was going on here? Perhaps the best example of what was going on here was shown one evening when they all went to a movie. Like every Friday, they would take them out to a movie. And one of the researchers were very astute. This was 1944, so all these movies were these romantic comedies, these classic American films. And the way this worked was there was this big theater, and this was in a small town, so these guys were all in one corner, and the rest of the townspeople were in the rest of the corner. And the researcher was talking about how he'd be watching this movie with these guys, and it would be just like everyone else. They'd laugh at the jokes, they'd cry at, I don't know if these dudes cried, but whatever. They'd laugh at the jokes. It's 1944, you can't expect that. So they'd laugh at the jokes, except he noticed there were some jokes where everybody else was laughing, and this corner of the theater was dead silent. Think of how creepy that is. Everyone's laughing here, no one's laughing here. And the researcher couldn't understand what was going on. And then he pieced it together. Whenever there was food on the screen, the men wouldn't laugh. They didn't even hear the punchline. All they could see was the food. And that's what I want to tell you. That simple insight is the essence of what we think is the psychology of scarcity. When you're short on something, for example, you're hungry, your mind automatically draws attention to that thing that you need. These guys needed food. There was a part of the mind that said, food. It's a part of the mind that keeps calling out to you. Hey, we're hungry. Hey, have you noticed? We need food. I don't know if you got my last 8 text messages, but we're really hungry. And it's just this bottom-up process. It's not, and I want to be clear here, it's not that these men said to themselves, let me think about what would be a very interesting thing to think about while I'm hungry. Hey, food, that'd be fun. No, in fact, it's the exact opposite. What do you not want to think about when you're hungry? Food. But you can't help but think about it. The mind keeps orienting itself automatically, and that's the word I want to use, automatically. In fact, here's another word, capture. This thing you need captures attention. It actually requires resources to shift away and think about something else. And as you can see, the men often weren't that successful. It distorted their whole worldview. Now, because their mind was so full of food, they're like, I'm going to start a restaurant. So how do we know this is true? Well, I'm going to give you a few more pieces of evidence, and then we'll move on. Here's a study from about 15 years ago. Very different method. It's not bringing people together and starving them. It's a lab experiment. They brought people into the lab, and they said, before you come, for 6 hours, don't drink anything. So these people showed up thirsty. So to half the subjects, when they showed up at the lab, they gave them water. To the other half, they said, thanks for coming for the study. Here's some pretzels. I like the delicious torture involved in most psychology studies. And this especially is good. Now you've got some people very thirsty and some people perfectly sated. So now what did we do? Well, the interesting thing about the Minnesota study was that it was very observational. It was like looking at what people did. This study is pretty psychometric. It's really using what we know about psychology to understand what's going on in deep processes of the brain. So one thing that psychologists have discovered is actually an old test, but it's powerful. It's probably the closest we'll ever come to like reading someone's brain. You know what I mean? Like directly. It's not an fMRI machine. It's not some complicated gadget that you put on. It's called a lexical decision task. What's the lexical decision task? It's fairly simple. You have a string of letters appear on the screen, like this. Then you say, that string is a word, or in this case, not a word. It's a shockingly trivial task. Even my undergraduates could do it, I think. But that's all it is. So why is this task interesting? Obviously, everyone gets it right. The question is, how quickly do you see that something is a word? How quickly do you recognize chair as a word? It turns out that if something is top of mind for you, if you're sort of thinking about it, or it's close to thinking about it, you'll recognize words related to that much quicker. So for example, if we put the word water, let's see what happens with the thirsty. And in fact, that's what they found. It's a set of words like this. They found that the thirsty were no different than the not thirsty in finding words like chair. But the thirsty were much quicker in seeing that the word water was a word. Now we see in a totally different, and here's one thing you should know. The differences here are at the level of 50 milliseconds in response time. Why is that important? Because, you know, conscious control, you probably think you're really fast, but even you can't control your mind below 300 milliseconds. So differences of 50 milliseconds really tell us it's not a top-down conscious process. It's a bottom-up process. These men, literally beyond their control, see the word water more quickly. Now, there are tons of studies like this. I'm not going to go through many of them. Some of them are fun. One of them has a beautiful title. One of my favorite title papers is All I Saw Was the Cake, which is, I think, you don't even know what the paper's about. The title says it. Yeah, let me, I should tell you, I always get an itchy feeling whenever I present this slide, because first, I'm not joking, I do need to drink. And second, when I first made this slide, I don't know why I've never changed it, maybe because I like this story. I made it to give a talk in Norway. So as I was putting these words up, I started to have this sinking feeling. What if it turned out? You know what I mean? And then I started thinking, why these words? Was I like really shopping for IKEA furniture or something? I can just tell you none of this made sense to me. So that's the hypothesis I'm going to tell you. In a way, it's super trivial. And it is super trivial. The hypothesis is, and I won't spend more time on that, we can talk about evidence. We have plenty of evidence. For example, we can show ways in which the poor automatically are focused on making ends meet. Their mind, just like the thirsty for water, their mind is immediately captured by things related to money. And we can go through that if you guys want, but you can take my word for it. What I want to tell you is there's something quite... We started by talking about my time management problems or the poor money management problems, but there's something quite useful about having scarcity capture your attention. Just think about an animal out in the woods, and it's hungry. Wouldn't you want a bottom-up attention process that kept telling that animal, food, hey, there's food over there. I don't know if you paid attention, but there's food over there. Of course it makes sense that we would want a very fast process to capture our attention for things that have a great deal of need for us. And so once you realize there's something useful about this, you'll also realize there's actually something very useful about the psychology of scarcity. So go back to my time example. I told you all the shitty things I do with my time. But picture yourself working on a project, let's say a paper or a report or a chapter of a book or something. Now assume that the deadline for this thing is many weeks away. What does a day in your life look like? You sit down, you start to write it. You're like, oh yeah, this is pretty good. Then you say, oh, I've got that email I've got to deal with. Let me deal with that email. Then since you're already dealing with the email, I mean, how could one round of going to ESPN hurt now? You're already on the web browser. You might as well see what's going on. Then a couple of hours later, you say, okay, well, back to that project. Oh, no, can't. It's lunchtime. Time to go for lunch. And that might be your day, and you get a little bit done. Now imagine the same thing is due tomorrow. What do you like? You're locked in. You are focused. You don't even think about going to ESPN. That doesn't even intrude. Angry Birds, you're not sure what that is. You are just focused. And that's the benefit of focus. We know from studies that when there's time scarcity, when there are deadlines, people are more productive. Here's my favorite example of this. There's a very interesting research on how organizations, how meetings happen. Okay? So I know you're thinking, how can I get that job? How can I get the job of going around studying meetings? But in fact, people have done this. They go and they study all sorts of meetings. And they sit in them and they observe. And an interesting pattern has emerged across all of these meetings. Whether it's a meeting by top executives of an organization or meetings by a club at some university. Whether it's a meeting to decide on something or to brainstorm about something, the similar pattern emerges across all these meetings. Here's how it works. In all these meetings, people start off. And when they start off, for a while, like Ray will say something. And then I'll say, very interesting point, Ray. And then I will say something purportedly related, but completely unrelated, just something else. And then someone else will say something completely unrelated. And then conversation will meander and it'll go everywhere, blah, blah, blah. But then something happens. Always at roughly the same time. It's called the midpoint transition. It happens at the halfway point of the meeting, where everybody says, shit, that's all we have left, and then people get serious. There's no more meandering, people stay on target, people just like talk about, and this is the essence of the benefit of scarcity. There are benefits to focusing. And that's what I want to start with. I want to start with just reminding you that when you are experiencing scarcity, it's like your mind is just focused on this thing, on this pressing task or need, and all this other shit, Angry Birds or temptations, everything else falls outside this tunnel, and that's wonderful. That's why it's great to focus. In fact, let's go back to the poor. Here's an interesting thought experiment. The poor are so focused on making ends meet. Well, how can we see the benefits of that? So we did a little study where we just got people in South Station, that's a train station in Boston. And they're rich people, they're poor people. We just said to them, hey, when you get into a taxi in Boston, what does the meter start at? Actually, here's a question. When you get into a taxi in New York, what does the meter start at? Don't you need to yell out the answer. Just think, do you know the answer? Now, interesting fact, when you ask this question, there's a really good predictor of who knows the answer to this question. Can you guess what it is? The poor. Even though guess who does not take taxis? The poor. But here you'll see the percentage low SES who know it are like roughly almost 2.5 times as likely to know this answer. This is just taxis. If you want to have fun, you should go and stop. You should go to a supermarket, wait outside, and say to people, hey, can we do a little study? I'm doing a little study, and can I just get your receipt? Look, I'm not responsible for what happens to you at this point. I'm not actually suggesting you go and do this, but you could do this. It helps if you don't look like Ray or me. But anyway, so you ask people for their receipt. They'll give you the receipt. And you say, okay, I have a few questions for you. You just bought Crest toothpaste. Yeah, I say, yeah, I remember that. Say, what did you pay? Now, if it's a relatively well-off person, they'll give you an answer like, I think it was $3. Could have been $5, maybe $7. I'm sure it was single digits. If there's a place where you can check off single digits, put me down for single digits. You can even ask them, how much did you just spend? You just paid this amount. And they'll say, 50, 70, 100. Not more than 200. Pretty sure not more than 200. Because this is not a Whole Foods, so let's just go with that. But now in those same areas, the same survey, you ask the poor, they'll say, Crest toothpaste, that was $2.79. It was on sale. The poor know what they're doing. They're paying attention to price. So much so that there's a savviness that the poor have, and the savviness that the busy have with time. Like when you get very busy, you book 15-minute meetings. Who books 15-minute meetings? The busy do, because they know the value of 15 minutes. But here, I'll tell you an example with the price knowledge stuff. So I hope all of you have been to sort of Costco or Walmart or any of these great American institutions where you can buy not just like a 6-pack of toilet paper, but a 46-pack of toilet paper. Or maybe even a 100-pack of toilet paper. I don't know. I'm sure it goes up and up. And why would you ever buy a 46-pack of toilet paper? Okay, I don't want to get into that. Let's just, what are some economic reasons you may buy a 46-pack of toilet paper? Well, one obvious reason, well, you guys know what it is, cheaper, right? It's a quantity discount. Next time you're in the supermarket, after you've done the survey outside, go inside and just walk down the aisle and just keep track of every item which is sold at different quantities, okay? And just try and quantify how big the quantity discount is. So marketing researchers have done this, and they find something interesting, which is for about 20% of products, there's not a quantity discount. There's a quantity surcharge. Why is there a quantity surcharge? Well, Consumer Reports called this one of the sneakiest consumer tricks out there. Seems to me a little bit over the top. There are a lot of sneaky shit out there. But it is a trick, which is, for most consumers, they walk in and they presume there's a quantity discount. So they just grab the 46 roll of toilet paper. It's a good way to kind of, make a little bit extra money. Sell more toilet paper at a higher per unit price. So it turns out that studies have actually tried to predict in which supermarkets we see this. Any guesses? Sorry? You never see this in a poor area. The poor don't fall for this because they pay attention to prices. This is all by way of saying that if you were to understand the psychology of scarcity, you first need to understand that there is something very beneficial about all of this. The reason we focus on all this stuff is it has some benefits. So it's kind of a funny thing to say because I started with some of the worst consequences of scarcity. So how do we understand why this same force, which actually looks quite beneficial, leads to some pretty bad outcomes? So let's go back to this tunnel. So Stephen Covey, I don't know if you guys know who Stephen Covey is. Yeah, it's a very good book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Am I going to lose tenure for saying I like that book, Ray? You're not going to tell anyone, are you? It's not videotaped or anything. We're fine. We're okay. Anyway, I like that book. And in that book, he has a very nice insight about time mismanagement. And his insight, I think, can be understood or reframed through the psychology of scarcity. See, when you're experiencing scarcity, what are you focused on? All the urgent stuff. You have this deadline, so you're going to work, and you're focused. Your mind automatically focuses on it. Now, I've already told you there's some benefits, because the stuff that falls outside that you're not focusing on includes Angry Birds. Good, finally. I'm not on ESPN 8 hours a day. But guess what also falls outside? The important stuff. In fact, this is Covey's insight, that the busy people focus on the urgent and neglect the important. See, that's the power of scarcity. It captures our attention indiscriminately. When you're very busy, you put off Angry Birds, but you also put off that appointment to have that mole looked at. 'Cause that's not part of your deadline. Screw it. Everything gets put off. And that is, I think, the pernicious aspect of the psychology of scarcity. And if you think about it, in the case of time management, or especially loan management, think about what you're doing. You're focusing on making ends meet today. But making ends meet tomorrow, that's a whole different exercise. Nobody working on deadline is thinking, oh, great, I'm going to put this email off, but how will I find the time to do this email tomorrow? No, I'm not going to worry about that. I've got to finish this project. So we neglect the other stuff. Now, if you were dealing with somebody who is doing this, what would be the worst possible thing you could do? Well, it would be to offer them a loan. Because a loan looks very attractive to deal with the thing you're focused on, and its costs are on the things you're not focused on. So think of a payday borrower. A payday borrower is thinking to themselves, my God, I have to make rent this month. What am I going to do? I don't want to get kicked out. Great, here's a loan. It allows me to deal with the fire I'm focused on. You ask a payday borrower, how are you going to repay it? They look at you like you're an idiot. Because they're like, I don't know if you heard what I was telling you. I have to make rent this month. That's what I'm talking about. Why are you talking about this other thing, which is completely unrelated to the problem I'm focused on? It's a little bit like the person at that meeting who brings up the conference you have to deal with in 3 months when you're all busy trying to plan for the conference this month. Who's this person? But that's exactly the psychology of scarcity, and that's why loans are so intrinsic. So here's something I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that a loan, whether it's borrowing time by putting off a project, or whether it's borrowing money, is intrinsic to the psychology of scarcity. So how would I test that? Well, we did the obvious thing, and we tested it using, that's right, Family Feud. I'm sure it's pretty clear to you why that is. Do you guys know what Family Feud is? Yeah? No? Some people don't know what Family Feud is? Oh, you're missing out. Really, it's one of the great American inventions. Because it really addresses a problem with like these sort of quiz shows. I don't know if you guys watch Jeopardy or any of these shows, but when you watch them, you're like, what weirdos know the answers to these questions? Like, are they reading Almanac in the bathroom, or what are they doing? And you're not that interested, because who's interested in that? Maybe a small subset of weirdos who read the almanacs in the bathroom. I hope you guys don't like Jeopardy. Maybe all of you like Jeopardy. Now you're turning on me. But nevertheless, let's just go with it. I don't think many people like Jeopardy. The show hasn't been around for that long. So, but Family Feud deals with that problem head on. It says, how do we have a quiz show that doesn't require you to know anything? Right? They said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask a question of the people. But before we ask people that question, the contestant, we're going to ask 100 people randomly selected the same question. Now, the contestant's job is to just guess what these other 100 people chose. It's like democratizing truth. It's not clear what the right answer is, but these people, whatever they guessed. So here's an example, one of my favorite ones. Name something Barbie could sell if she needed to raise money fast. Oh, come on. Let's play the feud. Anyone want to guess? Car? Very good. That's right. That's number 1. Number 2? It's not the dream house. The dream house is like number 4. I don't know why. I think it's because people feel like real estate is this solid thing that you shouldn't just sell off. Plus, I think you guys are being unrealistic. A dream house like that would take time to unload. She needs the money fast. Come on. Close to close. Her shoes. Yeah. And someone said? Yes, that's number 3. Ken is number 3. You guys would make great Family Feud contestants. Congratulations. So why did we do this? I don't know why we did this. It was just fun. No, because, see, the funny thing about scarcity is when I'm talking about time, I'm talking about money, those are all like, they're concrete, they're hard. But if I tell you that it's about scarcity, then you know, what is the scientific method? The scientific method is, if we feel you've got a concept, you can distill it into its essential components and study it in the lab. See, I'm making a bold claim. I'm saying time, money, it's all about scarcity. So it could be scarcity of anything. So for example, we brought Princeton undergraduates into the lab. We had them play Family Feud. We told them it's very simple. You're going to receive round after round of Family Feud. You're going to make your guesses, and how well you do will determine how many points you earn, which will determine how much money you earn in this experiment. That's Family Feud. But guess what? Since it's scarcity, we could induce scarcity of Family Feud seconds. We could create the Family Feud poor. So half the undergrads were given plenty of time each round, and the other half were given very little time. So now we have the poor and the rich. They're not like the poor and the rich in the world. They're not people. They're randomly assigned. It was just a condition they found themselves in. And it's not poor and rich in any meaningful sense. Like, I mean, it's just seconds from Family Feud. But if what we say is right, then we ought to see these people acting like scarcity in the world. So how would we do that? Well, we did the same study, and then what we said was, here's what we'll do. We have poor, rich. Let's give them the ability to borrow. Let's give both of them, some of the time, half the people, got the ability to borrow. And what we did was we said you can have an extra second, or as many seconds as you want this round, but it'll cost you 2 seconds in the future. So if you thought payday loans were usurious, I mean, we've gotten 100% interest rates for 30 seconds. We're doing pretty well. I'm pretty sure we can convert this to Bitcoins and make a lot of money. I mean, it is Family Feud seconds we're making, but it'll work out. I'm confident. This is what's going to pay for Ray's kids' college. So what do we find? What we found was that these people who are randomly assigned to be Family Feud poor behave just like the poor in the world. So here's the blue line of how much borrowing was taking place. And the yellow, I'm colorblind. Is the top one yellow or green? Yellow? Yellow, fine. Yellow, you're all lying to me. This is some cruel practical joke. Fine. The top line, I'm not going to fall for your. The top line is the rich and the bottom line is the poor. And what is this number? It's the percentage of time each round going to paying off the debt they've already incurred. And look, the Family Feud poor are driving themselves into a debt trap. Debt here makes no sense. It's not like there's miraculously more time that's going to show up in the future, but it's clear that they're driving themselves into debt. And it's so ironic because just like the poor and the rich in the world, if we look at performance, what we find is that, well, here, I'll show you what we find. Here's the rich and the poor. Here's the no borrow condition. Here's the borrow condition. Give the rich the ability to borrow at our usurious interest rates. The rich do slightly better or about the same. Give the poor just the ability to borrow, and they earn a lot less. They simply just misuse the borrowing, and they end up... Okay. Ray tells me I've got a scarcity of time. Okay. So this is the first lesson I want to take away, that there's something about borrowing which is intrinsic to the scarcity of time. That's intrinsic to scarcity. But I think there's much more. To me, borrowing is probably the second biggest problem of scarcity. The biggest problem of scarcity, I think you already see in this study, which is you end up thinking about the thing, about scarcity, about the thing generating scarcity, whether you want to or not. It's a constant preoccupation. It is a thing that's constantly calling to your mind. So what does that mean? Oh, I'm going to go a little over time because you've got to see this, Ray. This is just for you. This is a study that shows that. So what do we do here? We did a word search. So we gave people this simple word search, here are the words. And then we just said, I'll do this faster. Each time you look for a word, then you get a new puzzle. You're not going to listen to me until I show you. Street is right here. All right? Okay, now you can listen to me. Okay, so for half the subjects, we replaced the word street with the word cake. Replaced the word picture with the word donut. Can I see where this is going? With delicious words. And what we were interested in is look at the word cloud. Every subject saw the word cloud. How quickly did you find the word cloud if you just searched for picture versus if you just searched for donut? Well, it depended on one fact. If you were not a dieter, it didn't matter. But if you were a dieter, you were much slower to find the cloud if you just searched for donut. It's as if you were like, oh, donut. And when you should be looking for the cloud. But that's the essence of it. Whatever task you're doing, even if that task has nothing to do, no benefit from thinking about this thing, you're going to keep thinking about it. That's the most pernicious aspect of being preoccupied. You're very busy. You think it's terrific to be working on deadline. That's great. You go home and you're supposed to spend time with your kids. We've all had this experience. Guess where part of your mind is? Back on this thing. You're not very present. You're having dinner with a good friend who's telling you about their impending divorce, and you're like only partly there. Part of your mind is still on this deadline. That's the essence. And I want to call this, I wanted to talk about a concept called bandwidth. This is the mental sort of capacity we have. Bandwidth is my catch-all for, and it implies a bunch of things like clear thinking, self-control, learning, memory. All of these things rely on bandwidth. You've all had a lot of bandwidth. You're tired, you have very little bandwidth, you're very alert, you have a lot of bandwidth. Everything is improving. And it implies a lot of behaviors. For example, when do you snap at your friends or your children or your co-authors or whatever it might be? You felt it. You're like not fully there and you just can't control yourself. When is it that you forget something? You forgot your keys. When is it that you end up eating unhealthily? When you're on deadline. When do you make bad choices? It's because there's this core resource. And what I want to tell you is that scarcity, its biggest effect is to tax bandwidth. That what it does is, this is the bold claim I want to make, that scarcity leaves us with less mind. Why is that? Well, it doesn't actually change the amount of bandwidth we have, but there's a part of your bandwidth that keeps going to this thing. It's like a computer processor that's running a background program that's slowing everything down. So how would I test this? Well, Trust me when I tell you that there are two components of bandwidth. I'm not going to go into what these are. These are psychometric measures, executive function, and fluid intelligence. Let me tell you what we did to test bandwidth. First, we went to a mall in New Jersey. I hope you've all been to a mall in New Jersey. You shouldn't end life without having done this wonderful experience. It is really a wonderful experience. And if you haven't, you should just leave now and go, because they're still open. And when we did this mall, we gave people these tests, IQ tests that are measures of bandwidth, impulse control tests that are measures of bandwidth. But we wanted to do what we did with the dieter study. We wanted to somehow make them ever so subtly think about money, because now we're interested in, does being poor affect bandwidth? So instead of cake, we kind of tickled them with money. So half the subjects took these IQ tests. That was it. The other half, before they took the test, we asked them a question. Hey, Joe is a fictional person, has his car break down. What are some options Joe has? It's just like reading the word D-O-N-U-T. It's a totally fictional exercise. It's not even a real donut. There's not real money. It's not your money. But it gets the mind ever so subtly thinking about money. So what do we find? Well, here's IQ. The poor are a little lower than the rich in IQ. Then when we tickle them, get them to think a little bit about money, nothing much happens to the rich. The poor suddenly look much stupider. Much stupider. And I'll tell you how much in a second. This is impulse control. Poor, a little bit less impulse control than the rich. Tickle them, minor effect on the rich, huge effect on the poor. Just getting people, the poor, to think a little bit about money, all of a sudden their cognitive capacity seizes up. Now, but that's not what I'm telling you. I'm not telling you, oh, you go around and you get people to think about it. The world has its own initiations. The poor on their own have lots of reasons and will end up thinking about it, much like the people in the hunger study. So what did I want to do? I want to show that the same person, when they're poor, has less capacity without me there to tickle them or do weird shit. So how do we do that? Well, this is sugarcane. It's an interesting crop. It's grown once a year. The farmers get paid once a year. I don't know if you remember, Ray, but remember when we were grad students, Harvard would pay us once a semester? That had the same problem that these sugarcane farmers have. In January, when that payment had run out, or like I hadn't got my new payment, it was like, I don't know if I borrowed money from you, but I was like near the end. I was like, what am I going to do? These farmers are the same. The month before harvest, it's very tight. They're struggling to make ends meet. The month after harvest is great. They got a lot of cash. Why is that interesting? We get the same farmer when they're poor and when they're rich. Trust me when I tell you that this has nothing to do with nutrition. We can check all that. It has nothing to do with working. It's nothing. The only difference is they're poor and they're rich. Okay? So now what can we do? Well, we can go and measure their bandwidth. And in fact, just like in the mall study, thousands of miles away, you see exactly the same effect. The same farmer, when they're poor, is much less correct on ravens than when they're rich. The same farmer makes many more mistakes on this impulse control task. How big is this effect? And why do I keep telling you this is huge? Well, remember what I told you about psychology and torture? There's a whole group of psychologists who do sleep study sleep. And here's what they do. They bring subjects into the lab and say, okay, you guys, here's a nice climate-controlled, cool room with a nice bed. You guys will sleep all night. Good night. You guys, no sleep for you. In fact, I have a research assistant who will sit right next to you, and if they see you nodding off, they're going to shake you awake. Next morning, 9 o'clock arrives. You guys very well rested. You guys have just pulled an all-nighter. And if there's one thing college has taught you, you're an idiot after an all-nighter. That term paper you wrote at 4 in the morning that sounded great, in retrospect, oh my God, this is awful. So what they've done is they do these studies, and then they measure the impact of this all-nighter on IQ. And you can imagine it's huge. Okay? And this is why you should be more afraid of a drowsy driver than of a drunk driver. So this gives us a benchmark, though. We can ask, how big is the effect of poverty relative to this? An extreme benchmark, but still gives us a benchmark. It turns out poverty is about 75% of this effect. Every day. The poor are 3/4 of pulling an all-nighter, but every single day. So these are not small effects. These are huge effects. The effect of poverty to tax bandwidth tells us that I think, is the biggest effect of scarcity. When we started thinking about, and this is where I think economics is wrong, when we talk about scarcity of time or scarcity of money, you say, what am I short on? I'm short on time, or I'm short on money. That's the physical commodity. That's where there's trade-offs. I would argue that's not the most important thing. What you're really short on is you're really short on bandwidth. that your scarcest resource when you're experiencing time or poverty is bandwidth. And I think we make a large number of mistakes in managing poverty and in managing time by not recognizing this fact. I'll just give you 2 examples, and we can talk about others later. The first is, imagine I had a program for low-income individuals that was a financial aid program that was to get them into college. Now, they would give generous financial aid. And imagine I said, oh, but to get the form to apply for the program, you have to pay $500. Everyone would say, that is a stupid idea. You're taxing the poor with the one thing that they lack, money. That'd be dumb. But since the poor also lack bandwidth, we would agree that taxing them on bandwidth would be an equivalently dumb idea. But in fact, that's what we do. A FAFSA form to apply for financial aid is a 30, 40-page form that is full of financial complexity that raises a lot of hurdles for the poor. And studies show that that simple fact, having such a complex form, is enough to keep quite a few people from applying. And in fact, we don't even think of bandwidth as a resource. We're happy to willy-nilly just tax people's bandwidth all the time. And the first thing I would take away is that bandwidth taxes are regressive. When we start taxing bandwidth because we want people to comply with an incentive in a conditional cash transfer, when we tax bandwidth because we want people to do this and this to get for a program, we are effectively charging something that's more expensive for the poor to provide than for the rich to provide. Let me end with something else, which is an example of bandwidth management. Since I started with time, let me end with time. About, I think it was 5 years ago, I went to a dinner, and it was really good. I mean, like, awesome. The food was good. The conversation was really good. It was one of the best dinners I'd had in a while. I was trying to figure out what the hell happened. Because after all, these were the same friends I'd been out with before. It's not like they'd mysteriously gotten more interesting. And I'd been at this restaurant before, and not like the food was, but it was great. Then I realized what had happened. At about 3 in the afternoon, or a little earlier in the afternoon that day, I had dropped my cell phone in the toilet. So at the dinner, I didn't have my cell phone. And it's not like at dinner I would have spent the time just on my cell phone. But what I would have done was, while waiting for people, I might have opened it up. And I might have said, oh, let me just look at what email has come in. What was I doing in that moment? I was doing to myself, with time, what we did in our mall study with the poor. Because inevitably some email would have come in that reminded me of something that then would have gotten my mind thinking about all this stuff. I was going out of my way to exaggerate the bandwidth tax, simply by virtue of having this little device that made me just sort of constantly queued me up with the thing that I was lacking. And think of how terrible of a bandwidth manager, even though maybe I'm a bad time manager, but I'm a really terrible bandwidth manager with something as simple as that. Because when I went out to that dinner, my goal was to enjoy that dinner. But most of the time, I was going out of my way to ensure I wouldn't have bandwidth for that dinner. And we're terrible bandwidth managers in many ways, partly because we don't understand that bandwidth behaves differently than time. Time is a little bit like a shelf with items of different sizes. In fact, your Google Calendar makes it clear that's all it is. Oh, here's a 30-minute thing. Here's a 15-minute thing. Oh, look, they fit right next to each other. Oh, it's not even a jigsaw puzzle. It's so trivial. Even I could do this. Bandwidth is not like that. Why? Because as you saw in the hunger study, you don't control your bandwidth. Bandwidth is controlled by lower order processes. So for example, if you want to have a strategy meeting where you're thinking about the future and thinking broadly, you probably don't want to have a meeting before that where you talk about how you're really short in finances this month. Because you're going to go into that strategy meeting still thinking about this and not able to not think about it no matter what. So while Google Calendar and all these calendars make you think it's just arranging these things and fitting them in, it's actually much less like a shelf than more like putting art on a wall. Some pieces fit next to other pieces pretty well. Other pieces fit pretty poorly. Why? Because this item makes you think about this item. So let me just stop there and say that maybe that's the biggest lesson I take away in the psychology of scarcity. That if we want to really manage scarcity, we have to become much better managers of bandwidth. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Ray says that if there are questions, I should take them. I'm actually open to take them. Yeah.
So
Do you want to speak up a little bit? Or I'll reframe the question. Yeah.
Sure. So in the beginning of the talk, you said the poor are quite sensitive to prices, that I suppose they're conditioned, so they're very careful about spending in the way the rich people are not. But again, under certain conditions, they become completely insensitive to that high interest rate of payday loans. So could you just...
Yeah, let me talk about it. It does feel a little inconsistent. I think the way to understand it is the poor are expert at making ends meet today. They're expert at making the dollar go far today. So an interest rate, which looks like a price to us, is something, a price in a domain they're not paying any attention to. So they're very insensitive to those prices. And in a way, this is also just implies how we need to rethink scarcity. It's not that the fact that the poor are perpetually poor that's the issue. It's that they're poor right now. That's what scarcity is. It's scarcity right now. So that means someone who's doing pretty well and has a pretty severe shock has now entered the psychology of scarcity, irrespective of whether the future is or whether the future is not. Does that make sense? So what people are bad at is things outside the tunnel, things involving not making ends meet right now. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You know that some people use meditation to free their mind. Do you think that if you train your mind, you can actually empty your bandwidth and use it like for the full each time when you want to focus on something?
So the question is around meditation. And I think one of the most sort of out there ideas that 5 years ago I honestly would have said, this is a dumb idea put forward by people who are clearly upper middle class trying to impose their views on others, that now I actually find totally compelling. Which is if you just take a logic of what I'm saying. The logic of what I'm saying is the bandwidth tax, which is huge, is created by having these intrusive thoughts that you cannot control. Well, the psychology on intrusive thoughts suggests that teaching meditation, teaching mindfulness, teaching cognitive behavioral therapy can be very useful to prevent intrusive thoughts. So I'm with you. I think that I would love to see a study which simply takes low-income individuals and simply teaches them some of these techniques and sees what the consequences are for decision-making. Because I didn't get a chance to talk about this, I think the consequences of bandwidth tax for decision-making are enormous. After all, that's why I tried to illustrate bandwidth is so central. Like, why might the poor be worse parents? Well, being a good parent requires bandwidth. Why might the poor not take their medications as well as they should? That requires remembering. Nearly every decision in life that the poor seem to do worse at. So I'm willing to agree with you. I think it'd be great. I think it'd be crazy, but interesting if it turns out meditative training or CBT or any of these mindfulness techniques. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. But that's a slightly different effect. We can talk about that. The CBT stuff, Jens Ludwig and others have this paper. Yeah, that's a slightly different. We should talk about that. Maybe yeah, but that's exactly. I think that's a yeah.
Management. What have you specifically taken away from your research? How have you changed how you manage your time?
So the question is, how do I manage my time better? It's all around bandwidth management. I'm not saying I've done a good job of it, but the times when I was doing the best, it totally changes your life when you're thinking about bandwidth management. For example, think of your calendar. There's certain tasks that require bandwidth, which means sort of open and just like being able to think openly. Other tasks that don't require bandwidth, you can just have a meeting after meeting after meeting. So what you really have to do is segregate the tasks that require lots of bandwidth and give yourself big hours of freedom, and put all the tasks that don't require bandwidth that can be back to back and put them together. But if you look at your calendar, you'll see that there's very little open real estate. And it's one of the most pernicious aspects of a meeting culture. It's very hard to say, I need 3 hours to think solidly about something. But you'll know there are tasks that just require even an hour to get into it. And how are you? So I think a lot of organizations are now screwing this up, because what it means is that certain types of thinking work are now getting done, but other types of thinking are just not getting done. There's a reason why many people feel they've had their most interesting ideas when they were undergrads, because they had shit all to do. They had empty time. And empty time and the feeling of not having anything imposing on time makes a big difference. So I've changed that completely. And it can be one thing I've proposed half-heartedly. But I think even if organizations just said, we're going to have meeting-free Fridays, that would change the entire feeling of bandwidth. Now you have a whole time where there's free. But I don't think people think in those terms. I don't even know what questions to call out back there.
How do you think this affects global economy when you have the poor countries managed by the rich part of the population?
When the poor are managed by the rich?
So if you look at the poor countries, very often it's the rich people in the country that manage the whole country. So how does scarcity affect
I mean, I had thought there'd be much more of a projection sort of bias, but I actually think the deepest bias here, Cass Sunstein calls this bandwidth neglect. I think the deepest bias we have in understanding others is that we neglect bandwidth. In understanding ourselves, we neglect bandwidth. So what that means is the manager of a McDonald's sits there and says, oh, this employee is stupid. This employee is not stupid. That's not what's happening. And it happens in life. You see someone yelling at their kid. Do you say, shitty parent? Or do you say, just somebody whose bandwidth is compromised? We never say that. Think of yourself. When you're yelling at your kids, a part of you says shitty parent, and a part of you says, yeah, but I was bandwidth compromised. So I think that that's the biggest management issue. Is it's just not the way we kind of think about others and think about time. Is there other questions? Yeah.
So you're talking about how when we feel constrained, right, and you have this taxing bandwidth, but are there any ways to measure when we actually feel that constraint, right? Because we're all like cash constrained, but the rich don't feel the constraint even though it's real. So is there like a way to measure when that actually kicks in?
Yeah, I would love to know. I mean, one thing that we've discovered is, and I think of this as the way of separating frugal people from people experiencing scarcity. See, the frugal know about prices too, like if you think of your frugal friends, but the frugal do not experience trade-off thinking unless they've given themselves a budget and enforced scarcity. But people who are just cheap and frugal, you can't even think about trade-off thinking because you're not actually. And I think trade-off thinking is at the heart of sort of like if you were to create a litmus test of is someone experiencing scarcity, it's a very easy, quick test that you can have to just get a sense of it. Yeah.
So there's been a lot of controversy for many years about cultural bias and standardized tests like the SAT and things like this. I'm curious whether you think often you see prices and money problems in those tests could actually be a big virus.
Oh, what a great question. And even if we don't say SATs, I wonder what would happen with GED questions. Like people taking GEDs are somewhat older, they're making ends meet. I wonder what happens. Like you just have a question now about like, I have no idea, it'd be super interesting. Right, it's like you're going out of your way to say, hey, by the way, here's something to think about instead of the next question. I hadn't thought of that. There's lots of data and it's a great question, yeah.
Put conditional cash transfers on one of your slides. I was wondering if you were planning on like talking about that.
Oh yeah, so I should say about conditional cash transfers. I mean, that's an example where I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying it matches the notion that we take bandwidth as free. So I don't know if you guys know what conditional cash transfers are. Conditional cash transfers are, we'll give you money, last question, we'll give you money, but in order to get the money, you have to satisfy this condition or these conditions. Or some conditional cash transfer programs are simple. There's one condition. Some conditional cash transfers, like New York City implemented one, had, I think, 60 conditions. Now, you can already see the problem, which is I might do an experiment and show, yes, people responded to the conditions or the conditions, but to respond to any condition requires a great deal of bandwidth. So it's as if this program is using as an input we're not even measuring. And as a result, we don't know what it's crowding out. And it's so ignored that when we go and think about adding conditions, we don't say to ourselves, each new condition means an extra unit of bandwidth. We just throw them all in. So I think there's this sort of conditionality has an element of it, which is inherently using up bandwidth. Now, of course, I'm not going to say it's not worth it. For example, one condition is take your kids to school, and we probably all agree that's worth the bandwidth cost. But I don't think people ever go through the logic of saying, is this worth the bandwidth cost? They just put everything on there because why not? That sounds like a good thing. Let's put that on. So, okay, that was the last question, so I'll stop there. Thank you all.
I'd like to thank Sendhil for what was really an enlightening talk. It's given us a lot to think about. Unfortunately, in all honesty, I have not been able to pay attention to the last 10 minutes of discussion because I was so obsessed with keeping track of time. So that somehow seems appropriate. I would encourage you to all continue the conversation during the reception that we have now. Thanks again.